everyone. I'm former Congressman Bart Stupak, a partner in Venable's Legislative and Government Affairs Group. Thank you for joining us for our webinar analyzing the timing and process, as well as the pitfalls, stumbling blocks, and legal challenges that we can expect in the days and weeks ahead as the results of the presidential election are determined. In a moment, I'll hand it off to Ron Jacobs and Janice Ryan of Venable's Political Law Group to walk us through this. But first, to set the stage, I'm going to turn over to my fellow Legislative and Government Affairs Group colleague, Josh Feinstone, to update us on where the vote counts are for the presidential, Senate, and House races. At the end of Ron and Janice's presentation, we'll open it up for questions, and we'll be joined by additional colleagues from Venable's Legislative and Government Affairs Group, Josh Raymond, Greg Gill, and Will Nordwin. Now, over to you, Josh Feinstone.
Thank you, Congressman Stupak. Josh Feinstone, Senior Policy Advisor with Venable. Happy to be here, and thanks for everybody for joining us. I'm sure all of you have had a long night, and we're still kind of processing all of the results and where things go. But to quickly level set, right now we have Vice President Joe Biden with 237 electoral votes and President Donald Trump with 214 electoral votes, with 88 left out there. As you all know, it's the race to 270 electoral votes. Recently, before we went live, the AP called Wisconsin, and that gave Joe Biden 10 additional votes. Arizona was called last night by Fox News, but the Trump administration is contesting that heavily. They believe there's still a path in Arizona that still has 11 electoral votes out there. Nevada is also tight with 6 electoral votes. Michigan currently has Vice President Biden ahead. That would be 16 electoral votes. North Carolina looks like it may end up coming in for President Trump with 16 electoral votes. Georgia may also come in for Trump with 15 electoral votes. And Pennsylvania is tight with both sides showing optimism that they could come in on top there. It's important to note that if President Trump were to take Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, he still would not have enough electoral votes to reach 270. If Vice President Biden does have Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, and Wisconsin, he would be right at 270. So the race for the White House is incredibly tight. There's some things that still need to be solved over the next hours and days. We're going to continue to follow that closely. Over in the Senate, as you all know, going into last night, Republicans held a 53-47 majority. As of right now, it's currently a 47-48 Senate GOP majority. We have a few seats still outstanding, including 2 Georgia seats, one of which may get solved today. There is some discussion that Senator Perdue may reach over 50% of the vote. If he does not, he would fall into a runoff, and that would be one of 2 runoffs in the state in the first week of January, the other being Kelly Loeffler against Warnock. We also have 1 outstanding seat in Michigan, where Senator Gary Peters is trying to fight off a furious challenge from John James. We also have the seat in Alaska that we believe will go to the incumbent Sullivan. And North Carolina still has not been called for Tillis, but we believe that that will go the GOP's way. So as it stands with Alaska and North Carolina, it looks like the Senate GOP will have at the very least 50 seats, could go as high as 53 before the 117th Congress commences. Lastly, in the House of Representatives, Democrats were expected to take more seats and dive into Trump country. That didn't really happen last night. And as it stands, the House Republicans have a 6-seat pickup, and it looks like they might finish out anywhere between an 8 to 10 seat pickup, which would leave the Democrats with a majority in the House of Representatives and retain all the gavels, and Speaker Pelosi would maintain her position, but their margin would tighten, probably somewhere around a 10 to 14 seat majority for Dems. And that's where we are going into this next phase of the election, in which our venerable colleagues Ron Jacobs and Janice Ryan will talk about the very likelihood that there will be contested elections in many of these states and how that process will work. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Janice Ryan and Ron Jacobs.
Great. Thank you, Josh, and thanks everybody for being here today. So Janice and I want to walk through the timeline and the different processes that will come into play to help determine what color those last few states become, red or blue. And so it's a potentially long process, but it could also be over relatively quickly depending on how the votes kind of come in and what the count looks like. So I'll turn it over to Janice to get started walking us through this timeline of how we actually elect a president and the steps that exist regardless of any question or confusion, and then the particulars of how some of those questions will get resolved as we go through this process. Janice?
Thanks so much, Ron. What you're seeing here on this slide is a visual depiction of the process that we have in this country for electing the president and vice president of the United States. And as you can see, this timeline is, it takes the better part of a year. We start out in February of June of the election, through June of the election year, with primary elections. Those are the elections where voters are choosing their delegates who will represent them at the political party conventions. This is how the parties choose their nominees for president and vice president. Those party conventions are held this year later than normal. And at the convention, the party will select who will represent them as their nominee for president and vice president. And then we get to the general election, which was yesterday. And on and before the general election day, voters cast their ballots in all of the states. They are, choosing their preferred candidates for president and vice president. What they really are doing is choosing slates of electors who will cast votes for president and vice president as part of the Electoral College. Between the election day and December 14th, when the Electoral College will meet and cast votes, is the process where we are right now. This is the process where we are counting votes, where the states will resolve any potential contests or controversies regarding the number of votes cast for which slates of electors. And once the electors vote on December 14th, we will wait until January 6th. Congress will meet in a joint session, and those votes will be counted. And then the president and the vice president will be inaugurated on January 20th. Sorry, moving back a little bit here. So we'll talk about the timeline in a little bit more depth here. November 4th to December 14th, as I mentioned, this is the critical period where we are right now, where the votes are being counted. There will be canvassing, any potential recounts that are requested or mandated by state law, any other kinds of contests, which Ron will talk about in a little bit, will be conducted and completed, or supposed to be conducted and completed before December 14th, which is when the Electoral College is scheduled to meet. Each of the electors will meet in their respective states and cast their votes for president and vice president of the United States. If there are any contests or controversies that are resolved according to state law by December 8th, the governor of the state will, under federal law, is required to send a certificate describing how those controversies have been resolved. And if that certificate is received by December 8th, that means that the electoral slate from that state is presumed to be valid in the event that there are any challenges to the electoral slate from that state at the time that Congress counts the votes. So right now, what are we seeing? What makes this year perhaps a little bit more unique? We are seeing that there are primarily two methods of voting. There are in-person ballots. Some of them cast on election day, some of them cast during early voting periods. What we've seen so far is that in-person voting seems to have gone relatively smoothly around the country, and we have had record-breaking turnout. The other thing that we are seeing this year due to the pandemic is a real expansion in the number of mail-in ballots that have been cast. There's still many ballots, although that number is shrinking as the hours go on and the state and local elections officials continue to count. But there are still ballots outstanding in key states, and counting mail-in ballots takes longer as a general rule than tallying the votes that are cast in person. So, we are still trying to understand how many votes remain to be counted, in what jurisdictions, which counties are those votes still outstanding, and what do we possibly see in terms of who we think is representative of those ballots that have yet to be counted. Will they be in favor of one candidate or another? I think overall what we have seen since last night and through this afternoon is that many of the outstanding mail-in ballots are in urban areas, which are tending to trend toward Joe Biden. Ron, flip it back to you.
Anna, thank you very much. One of our questions that came in was with respect to sort of the in-person voting, whether there are any major issues that anyone with the poll accounts. There hasn't been anything raised at this point. Went pretty smoothly in person for the most part, compared to what we've seen in some other years, perhaps. So, there's certainly things that can develop, things that pop up or that are discovered, but so far there's not a major that there have been any problems in our states. As Janice said, this election are unique in their number and their size, and so the states in particular that have not yet been called, there's a couple different rules that come into play, and each state gets to set its own state law on this. And so the general rule is for a mail-in ballot, it has to either be received by election day in the Secretary of State's office or the county board of elections, whatever it specifies in the state law, or it has to be postmarked by a particular day, whether that was Tuesday to state law, and then it has to be received by the election officials within a certain period of time. And this chart that, on the screen here is useful because it kind of shows that for the most part, if you think about Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin, states that have all of the absentee ballots in. There shouldn't be any more trickling in later because they are states that say you have to have the ballots in on that day, on election day. Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania are a little bit different. Those are states that say the ballots have to be postmarked by election day and then received by some date after that. In particular, Pennsylvania has been the subject of litigation this year, where the Pennsylvania Supreme Court determined that received by in the statute shouldn't apply, and that there should be a longer period of time afterward for the ballots to come in. So these three states, we don't know the answer to the outcome, and it may not be possible to know the answer for several days until the ballots come in. Now, one of the things with mail-in ballots is that if the margin of the known ballots, the counted ballots exceeds what's out there, then we have a pretty good sense of what the outcome is going to be. So, it may not be as big of an issue, but it also could be an issue with additional ballots coming in over time. This is one of those areas where I think there is possible. It's hard to say for sure, but certainly there will be questions about whether a ballot in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, whether ballots were postmarked by election day or by the date they were required to be postmarked, And then as they trickle in over time, concerns about whether they get there by those dates, what happens when a ballot shows up a few days after that. Presumably it should not be counted because the window is closed. I think this is another area where there's potential for litigation. You've probably heard that the Post Office, the U.S. Postal Service, has been accused of delays or delaying some of the mail-in ballots. There was a court order yesterday that the Post Office was supposed to sweep all the post offices in certain major jurisdictions to check for ballots that might be sitting around. That did not happen, from what I understand, reading media accounts. And so I think if you have a tight race in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, or Wisconsin, you can see a scenario where one of the candidates says, wait a minute, you just found 10,000 ballots sitting in a post office in that area. How can you possibly say that those shouldn't be counted? Every vote should be counted, and bring a claim in state or federal court over those ballots. So that's one area to kind of watch, would be to see if there are ballots found in any of those states, what the margins are. Would it make a difference if more votes were added to the mix? I think, generally speaking, the candidate who's ahead will push very hard not to get those counted. The state law is state law for finality purposes. But I think that would be the one area that I see where there could be sort of broad-based litigation right now. Obviously, there are other issues that could pop up or that are discovered as the time goes on. But to me, that's one obvious area where we might see litigation coming. So there are a few terms I want to kind of lay out there that you're likely to hear over the next few days. This is looking at the right-hand column on this slide. So the way elections work is what we're seeing now are all unofficial results. The official results come later when there's what's called the canvass, when all of the vote totals are determined and sent back into the state so that you get the full number. The canvass happens at different points in time with different states under each state law, but that's when you get sort of the official number determined. It's at that point in time that a recount can be declared. There are some states that have automatic thresholds for recounts if it's within a certain fraction of a percent. Other states allow candidates to request a recount no matter what. Sometimes they're on the hook for paying the cost of that recount. The recount goes back through and does what it suggests it does. It rechecks all of the votes in those states. So there can be a variety of different approaches taken depending on the kind of ballot. It was a recount that we saw back in 2000 in Bush versus Gore, as they were trying to determine whether the hanging chads were votes one way or the other in that race. So that's what we would see if people were questioning sort of the count. A contest is another procedure under state law that is a little bit different. This is where you're actually challenging the validity of the election. That, again, this could be where some of those, if there were ballots found sitting in a post office somewhere, you might say, well, wait a minute, the results aren't fair, there's fraud here, something like that. And then in the contest procedure, I should say, is something that is conducted in state court. There are particular procedures in each state law for how you conduct a contest. And then the other option would be litigation outside of that contest. So sort of collateral attacks on the process, seeking injunctions against election officials, things like that. So those are sort of the different things we'll see playing out depending on how close these numbers are, with different candidates raising these concerns. And we're focused today on the presidential, but certainly if there were particularly close other races, whether they be House of Representatives or Senate races or state or local elections, those things can all come into play. It's done on an election by election basis. So just because someone requests a recount for the state auditor doesn't mean that it would affect the presidential ballot recount. It's just on a particular basis. So those are the different processes to look out for and to hear that could be invoked in different states as we go forward. Janice?
Thanks, Ron. So once those things have been resolved, the idea here is that all of those things are resolved before the Electoral College has to meet on December 14th. So this is the way it's supposed to work. And there are certainly a number of scenarios in which that deadline of, the Electoral College being able to be ascertained and have them meet and vote on December 14th could, potentially be up in the air. But this is the way it's supposed to work. The electors, the slate of electors will be determined. The governor will determine, which slate of electors have won. And this is reflected on the earlier slide. I didn't touch on this, but remember, there are 528 total electors. Each state, the number of electors allocated to it equals the number of representatives allocated to that state in Congress, plus 2 senators. The electors that are determined to have won, and in almost all states except for 2, electors are allocated on a winner-takes-all basis. So the slate of electors that have been determined to win will meet in person on December 14th in each state that's set in a location set by the legislature. Usually it's the state capitol. The electors will vote. Each elector will vote. 1 vote for president and 1 vote for vice president on a written ballot. The ballots will be counted, and then the electors will complete what is called a certificate of vote. They're going to do 6 copies of this that will identify the votes for president and the votes for vice president. The electors will pair their votes, the certificates of vote, with the certificates of ascertainment, which is the determination of the governor by the governor that the electors have been elected from that state. And the certificates will then be sent by registered mail. They are required to send 1 set to the President of the United States, the Vice President, who is in his capacity as President of the Senate, 2 certificates to the Secretary of State of the state in which the electors met, 2 certificates to the Archivist of the United States, and 1 certificate to the Judge of the United States District Court of the district where the electors met. These certificates are required to be transmitted by December 23rd. As a general matter, this works. This is a very simple process, but it's also open to potential issues, which we have either never seen or rarely see. One issue could be potential competing slates of electors. What happens if in a given state it's not clear which set of electors should be appointed? There isn't history of this happening before, but it's something that we should keep in mind. There just isn't a lot of clear rules about what to do or how this will work. The other issue that you may hear about from time to time is this concept of faithless electors. As I mentioned, the electors are allocated to a presidential or vice presidential nominee on a winner-takes-all basis. But what happens if the elector decides not to vote for the individual candidate for president or vice president to whom the elector has pledged to vote? It is very rare. It has come up from time to time that an elector does not vote for the candidate that they are pledged to support. It has never changed the outcome of an election before. There are about 33 states that have laws that say the electors are required to vote for the candidates for whom they are pledged. And 15 or so of those states back up that requirement with some sort of sanction. Usually the faithless elector's vote will be canceled and the elector will be replaced with another elector who will support the candidate for whom they are pledged. And in a couple of states, that sanction is backed up with fines on the individual who is quote unquote faithless. But again, this is something that doesn't come up very often, and it has not before been a situation that has impacted the results of an election. So assuming that the electors have been able to send their certificates as required under federal law, we will see that the Congress will count the electoral votes in a joint session in the House chamber on January 6th. That date is set by statute. Congress could choose to change that date if they need to. But for now, it is going to be January 6th. The Vice President of the United States presides over the joint session of Congress in his role as President of the Senate. The Vice President will open the certificates and present them to 4 tellers, 2 from the House and 2 from the Senate. The tellers will read and make a list of all of the returns. Once the votes have been opened and counted, the tellers will transmit them to the Vice President. And if one of the tickets has received a majority of 270 or more electoral votes, the Vice President announces the results, and that shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons who are elected President and Vice President.
So that's the easy way, the easy path. If there's a hard path for the electoral votes, this is it here. And so Janice mentioned before that the safe harbor certification process, where if by December 8th, a certain process has been followed and a declaration by the governor has been made that the vote tally was determined according to the state procedures that were in place before, there's a presumption that the electors are valid. Here's where if either they aren't determined, that either they don't make safe harbor, or if conceivably it's never come up, but if Congress, it seems very difficult that Congress could bind itself not to challenge the electors at a certain level through statute. So I think this could happen. Now I think where we're getting to now is sort of a much more remote scenario than sort of the initial litigation, recounts, contests kind of thing. This is really a kind of uncharted territory, but the idea is that if the electors, whether there's competing slates or if there are, if Congress is challenging one of these slates, there's a process for dealing with that. And so the way it works is that there has to be, and it's designed to be very bicameral. So both the House and Senate have to be involved in this process. And the process for the challenge, keep in mind, comes up after the new Congress is sworn in. This is after January 6th. So we are talking not about the current Congress, but the new Congress. And so that makeup is a little bit different than potentially than the old one, or very similar in the Senate. The House looks to be a little bit different, but still a Democratic majority. So it looks safe to say a democratically controlled House and probably a Republican Senate, not quite certain on that front. Now, this is, while it's the new Congress, it is still the current vice president who presides as president of the Senate. So Mike Pence is a tie vote breaker in this process at this point in time. So the way this works, if there's an objection by at least one member of the House and one member of the Senate made in writing, then the objection is considered to be validly made, and the House and Senate move to their own chambers where they have a 2-hour period according to the procedures to discuss the objection and then vote on it by a majority vote. They come back together and announce the results, and the challenge only stands if both houses agree to the challenge to strike that particular set of electors. So I think it's a pretty hard scenario to see here, where you're going to see a lot of agreement between the houses of Congress, because presumably a democratically controlled House is not going to reject electors for Biden. So you're really talking about if it could get through the House, it would have to be to reject electors for Trump. And then you would have to say, well, would the Senate also vote to reject those electors? It seems a little bit unlikely if it's a Republican-controlled Senate. It certainly seems, unlikely if it's a tie and the vice president is casting the vote. So I think if it were to be a democratically controlled Senate, it seems like a pretty uphill approach there that you would look to be throwing out slates of electors unless something was really off the rails, quite frankly. I think it's just, it's so unprecedented. So, of course, we could always get there. This is 2020. We've been living in the pandemic for the past 8 months, so you just never know how to predict the future. But that does seem like a slightly more remote scenario to happen. The question then is sort of, okay, if we reject the electors, if there are two slates, like Janice mentioned, could you actually reject one and accept the other, or do you reject them all? It's not clear what that process looks like. And so the next issue for so these are some of the reasons that you might see members challenging would be sort of the questions about the faithless electors or the competing slates. It's just could be up in the air. But if you rejected enough slates where neither candidate has 270, then it becomes what's called a contingent election. And this is where you get really into your complicated constitutional law and how this all comes into play. But it's fairly rare. It has happened way back at the beginning of the Republic, and then a few times after the 12th Amendment was passed to specify the presidential and vice presidential procedures, but not recently, that's for sure. So the way it works is if a contingency is declared, then the House picks the president and the Senate picks the vice president. The way the House does it is interesting. It's done by state delegation. So the state delegation, so even if you have a Democratic majority in the House, the state delegations are what's important. And I'm going to jump forward to the next slide here for a second. These are the state delegations as they existed before last night. I haven't redone the math to figure this out. But there were 26 Republican delegations, 23 Democratic, and 1 tied. There are also 7 states with just 1 representative. I'm not sure how those numbers have changed overnight. It's possible that some of them have. But even what the I think bottom line is that with a Republican majority delegations, even a democratically controlled Congress would potentially pick a Republican president with that vote. So the way it works is you go to the state, you sort of caucus with your states, you cast your ballots and determine which way the state will vote, and then they cast the state vote. So each state gets 1 vote with a majority vote. And then the Senate picks the vice president. It's a simple majority vote. There's no state-by-state voting there. And if it's a tie, the vice president casts the tie-breaking vote. So in this case, we'd have a vice president casting a tie-breaking vote for himself if it came down to it. Now, again, like I said, I think this is a somewhat unlikely scenario, but there's actually a scenario, I think it's still mathematically possible. I was looking this morning to get to a tie at 269 to 269. I think that's becoming less and less likely as the votes get counted, but that's a scenario where you have a tie, no one crosses 270, and therefore you would have this contingent election process to resolve that. We talked about the state delegations. And so then what happens if the House can't select a president by Inauguration Day? So and this is where we get to really crazy scenario planning, but if the House can't reach a decision, then the new vice president would be selected would become the acting president on January 20th. So that presumes that the Senate has picked a new vice president in order to fill that seat, whether it be Vice President Pence or being reelected as vice president, or Senator Harris being selected as a new vice president. If you have a vice president, then he or she becomes the acting president on January 20th until the House can finally make a decision on who becomes president. If there's no new vice president, then under the Presidential Succession Act, the Speaker of the House becomes the acting president until a president or vice president is chosen. Because the Constitution says that an executive officer cannot serve in another position of the government, the Speaker would have to resign her seat in Congress in order to become sworn in as the acting president. If the Speaker says, no, that's not for me, then it becomes the President pro tem of the Senate, which is currently Chuck Grassley of Idaho. So he too would have to step down to become acting president, and then potentially changing the makeup of the Senate. So it gets to be some really weird sort of political scenarios out there if we get here. But again, this is sort of way down the road. We're right now on that very first phase, but it's just helpful, hopefully, out and understand sort of where these things can go from here. This slide, we're not going to spend a lot of time on, just sort of if something were to happen to either of the candidates, or particularly the winner of the election between now and Inauguration Day, there's some interesting sort of difficulties with not as much clarity as you might think as to how that gets resolved until the Electoral College votes. So once the Electoral College has voted in Congress, has accepted those results, then it becomes clear that the vice president who wins becomes the new president. Before then, there's just a lot of question marks in the process. So it's, hopefully everybody stays healthy. If you're interested in additional resources about all of these materials, there are some links here on the presentation as well. So that is our sort of tour of what's going on, what it looks like. Now we will do some, we've got some questions. As a reminder, you can add more questions to the queue so that we can talk through these things. So thank you all very much for the presentation, and now we'll turn to our questions.
Yeah, Ron Jacobs, this is Will Nordwind. I have one question from our audience that I'd like to maybe kick off with before we take a look at the other questions that have also come in. This was the first one in the queue. The question is, what grounds would President Trump, and I think you've covered some of this, but maybe if you could recap it, what grounds would President Trump have to take Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, and or Pennsylvania election results to court? Could you recap that? Sure.
So, I think right now, sort of sitting here at the outset, it looks to me to be more likely to be that it would relate to the mail-in ballots. That depending on the state, Pennsylvania, for example, I mentioned that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had extended the deadline for receipt of mail-in ballots because of COVID. The Supreme Court did not grant emergency review of that decision, the U.S. Supreme Court, under a presumption that sort of the state courts get to kind of deal with state election procedure laws. But that challenge may still go before the Supreme Court sort of on the merits in a full review. So, that's an area where the Supreme Court, it could get back to the Supreme Court quickly, and they could say, well, wait a minute, your state law, as defined by the state legislature, said that they have to be received by Election Day. We want to throw out any ballots that came in after Election Day. I think that's an unlikely scenario, but that's one that could come into play. Over the next few days, we'll see if more ballots come into other states where there's already a deadline. I think that would be an area where there could be a challenge, probably not so much by the president, but probably by Vice President Biden if there were a Trump lead and there were other votes out there. It's really hard to game out some of these things because of the sort of, not knowing the number of who requested the ballots, what the kind of partisan makeup is, who would be doing what. I saw some interesting information before the election where in some states, it's sort of the old adage that sort of the Democrats vote early and the Republicans vote on Election Day held true. And so in that scenario, you would presume that they're mostly Democratic ballots outstanding. But in other states, North Carolina, for example, the early vote was very much split evenly between the two parties. So, that would be harder for either of the candidates to figure out what they want to do with outstanding ballots in terms of any kind of a challenge there. Beyond that, Janice, I don't know if you have any thoughts, but it seems like from, what we've seen with just the standard election operating procedures, we're not as likely to see a Florida hanging chads situation. The machines mostly worked well. There could be something that's discovered, but right now it's not entirely clear beyond those mail ballots what you would do.
Great. Well, thanks, Ron. Go ahead, Janice.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up to say that, we may see efforts to request recounts in states where the margin is close and state law permits that. It would be, not unusual and is a process that's prescribed under state law. I think that the things that Ron has mentioned would be, the kinds of litigation that, are outside of the normal recount or contest process that we discussed at the outset.
Great. Well, thanks, Janice. And Ron, before turning back over to you for more questions, just wanted to remind folks that are watching this webinar for CLE credit that the code for that credit is Election 2020. I repeat, Election 2020 for those who are seeking CLE credit for this webinar. So back over to you, Ron, for more questions.
Great. Thanks, Will. And just as a reminder, anyone who has questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and we will make sure that that we turn to those. One question I have seen come up just from a procedural standpoint, the slides and recording of this video, of this presentation, will be available shortly after the next day or so. We'll make sure that everybody can get a copy of the slides. We had another question that came in terms of, let's see, sorry, I was looking at that. Regarding the Electoral College, how real of an issue are faithless electors? Janice, I know you talked a little bit about the faithless elector laws. Do you want to just kind of talk a little bit about the potential there?
I think it's generally not historically been an issue, and I don't really anticipate that it would be an issue going forward. Traditionally, the parties select, or the candidates for president and vice president themselves select the slates of individuals who will serve as electors. And, with care and thought in terms of who the individuals are that the parties or the candidates themselves are selecting, you will generally not see folks casting votes outside of the party that they have pledged to support and the candidates they have pledged to support. I think it's very rare and uncommon.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that seems very right as well. One other another question that came in was sort of about, it relates to what I was saying about Pennsylvania and the state Supreme Court versus federal courts. Janice, I don't know, have you followed much how the difference in sort of the Supreme Court seems to be treating some of the state courts versus the federal courts, where they're making changes to the state laws based on different lawsuits that were there?
Yeah, I haven't read all of the opinions. I have been following it, and my understanding is generally that the Chief Justice has sort of been playing a sort of central moderating role in the cases that we've seen so far that have come down, and that it seems like the common thread is reluctance to have federal courts make a decision close in time to an election that is different than the decision that has been made by the state legislature or state regulatory agencies that are responsible for the administration of elections. And so whether that continues post-election day, whether there is, a different outcome because of, the appointment of the new justice, to be seen.
Great. Also, just a little late-breaking news. It looks like there's a talk of a Trump lawsuit in Pennsylvania over two things. It seems that there's one, a question about whether there are the appropriate observers watching the ballot counting. And so I think that's another ground that they've come up with there. And we'll see whether that happens or not. Apparently the suit has not yet been filed, but they've made some announcements about that. There's also a suit in Pennsylvania questioning sort of the whether the proper voter identification procedures were applied for first-time voters. Again, I'm just kind of seeing this on the news wires as we go through this, but wanted you to be aware that there are apparently some other grounds that they're coming up with in terms of some of the lawsuits. So that is apparently happening. We had another question kind of back on sort of the postmark, whether if the state doesn't require a postmark, will it be counted? I think that was actually another part of the Pennsylvania decision, was that if it's received in time, and I'm kind of doing this a little bit by memory, but if the ballot is received within the window after the election, unless there's clear and convincing evidence that it was not mailed before the election, then it should be counted. I've always thought that was a very hard part of that decision, that if there's not a postmark on it, it's sort of usually the presumption would be that it doesn't count, but this sort of reverses that. The good thing, most ballots in the postal system have a barcode on them that actually allows the post office to track them. I'm not positive if they do in Pennsylvania. I would think they would, but you can tell the timing is not perfect because it has to be scanned into the system, but you can generally get a sense of when it was put into the system within a day or so and track it. So it would seem like that would, it kind of solves the purpose of a postmark. I know in Iowa, that if a ballot is not postmarked, if you can use the barcode to figure out when it was put into the postal system, it would still count there. So some of that will again, just depend on state law, but certainly be an interesting mix. Let's see, we have another question about sort of who gets to make some of the changes that if sort of what the courts might think of some last minute changes that were made, whether it be a legislature or the Secretary of State. I think, again, those are areas that we'll have to kind of see how they play out. Once ballots are sort of in the system, it's much harder for a court to say we want to take them out, just from a general kind of fundamental fairness piece in how courts view things. As I go through some other questions, let me maybe pause and see if any of our colleagues, Will, Josh, Bart, have anything they might like to add, just sort of about process, things they've seen. Bart, I know you were there in the House in 2000 when they were gearing up for the potential for Florida to go awry. Do you have any insight for us on what that was like and what some of the folks up there might be thinking about?
Well, as you know, it's always a tense time when they're counting votes. And I know in Michigan, because it's one of the states that are there, the observers at Detroit now, they're outside the room, but they all got their nose pressed against the glass like it was in Florida back in 2000 there. So there's going to be creative lawyering to get to some of these issues. You just raised Pennsylvania, and I think it's very creative, and the courts are designed to move fairly fast. I think since 2000, there have been so many changes, that practical changes that will lessen the lawsuits, but you can see the creativity already coming forward. And I do expect this matter, or at least a question or two, to get to the Supreme Court. Now, whether the U.S. Supreme Court will grant review of the issue or not remains to be seen. But it's pretty interesting, the creativity you're seeing on behalf of the legal profession on both sides.
Greg, any thoughts from you on sort of what we might see with things going forward?
No, I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Will or Josh, do you guys have anything you wanted to add? As I'm getting, there's a few more questions that come in that I will we can address, but I just want to see if you guys had anything you wanted to say.
I think we would maybe just some of the implications of what the potential outcomes here. It's fair to say that up until last night, there was a lot of speculation about what a Democratic sweep of the White House, Senate, and House would do with respect to implications for policy, not only in the last few months, a couple months of this year, but then going into the next Congress, the next 2 years. And I think it's fair to say from a policy perspective, if we're looking at a divided government as may be the outcome, let's just say, for sake of this argument, I think it's a oversimplification, but let's just say it's a President Biden and a Republican-controlled Senate retained majority. Then a lot of the more progressive policies that might have been if the Democrats had swept, obviously that we wouldn't expect those anymore, and so we might see more of a if it were to be a President Biden, more administrative action, executive branch activity to try to promote policy objectives versus a congressional or legislative agenda to promote those policies of a Biden presidency, if that comes to pass.
Yeah, and it also bleeds into the appointments that perhaps President-elect Biden is able to make. Before, if you were to have all three branches under your control, you may be able to get somebody who may be a little bit more progressive at the Department of Treasury, but now you have to get it through a Senate GOP McConnell-led chamber, and that will change the dynamics and will therefore change the direction of some of the policies that are going to be happening at the cabinet level as well. And so it was a massive shift from where people thought we might be going to where we may be ending up, and the policy ramifications are vast.
Yeah, Josh, Bart Stupak here. You're right. And when I was in Congress, 93, 94, Bill Clinton was elected. We had control of all three branches, or I should say all two branches, the House, Senate, and presidency. And again in 2009 and 2010 with President Obama. And we moved a lot of legislation, and most recently with the Obama administration, 2009, 2010, I'd go home, people would say, slow down, you're moving this legislation so fast, we can't keep up. You can't be moving it that fast. We need more time to review it. And so we're not going to have that now, because there's no way the Senate's going to flip. Gary Peters is in a real tough race in Michigan with Don James. So it's just not going to flip. So it's a good point. The president is going to do, if it's President Biden, I'm sure he'd be doing the same thing President Trump did. He'd use that executive orders and other.
Yeah, I think we may have lost audio with Bart. So maybe kick it back over to you, Ron.
Great.
We have another 4 or 5 minutes before we're done here.
Yeah, so this question I think actually is best for some of our legislative team, and I think you've touched on it a bit, but the question was about if Vice President Biden wins and there's a Republican Senate, what do we think about the prospect for a tax increase?
Go ahead.
I don't think there will be one. I think that there may be some room to revisit some of the tax provisions that were done through reconciliation if there's an ability to sort of, quote unquote, clean up a measure that was written inadvertently, but there will unlikely be any revisitation of state and local tax, for example. There may be some issues that come up through the expiration of provisions, and that may open up some negotiations on some tax deals. But I think what you're really getting at, whether it's tax or whether it's healthcare, government funding, you're going to have a dynamic where Vice President Biden, if he ends up being successful, is going to have to negotiate one-on-one with McConnell. You're probably not going to have this secondary Mnuchin Meadows with Pelosi and then a thumbs up, thumbs down to see if the Senate GOP accepts that. it is much more likely that the House of Representatives, the majority there, is going to be focused on ensuring that they protect their majority of 10 to 12 seats, and it's going to be unlikely that they're going to be looking to move strongly contentious legislation that's going to go die in the Senate. And it's unlikely that anything's going to move in the Senate unless it's got a bipartisan agreement with the president. And the president, if it's Biden, is going to be responsible for bringing the House of Representatives along.
Great. We had another question related to the Pennsylvania case in the Supreme Court. And I actually just read that, and this involves the question of whether the Supreme Court will consider on a full basis the expedited request that it rejected. And apparently the president's lawyers have asked the Supreme Court to hear the full case now and not just on a preliminary basis. So that could potentially go up to the Supreme Court sort of again for further consideration. This being the question as to whether, if the statute says the ballots have to be received by Election Day, there's actually a grace period there. So that I think wraps up all of the questions that we have in the queue. I'll turn it over to you, Bart, to wrap us up for the afternoon.
Well, thanks, Ron, and hopefully my audio is working again. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today for today's discussion. A recording of this session will be available shortly on our website. Once we have an outcome of this election, we hope you will join us once more as we talk about industry-specific webinars on our soon-to-be rescheduled election series. Your email, staytuned@hannibal.com for updates. And thank you for joining us.